We have easily the most recognizable name in poker today, Daniel Negreanu here on the show with us. We're extremely excited. Thank you for joining us, Daniel.
It is my pleasure, gentlemen.
Daniel, we heard you have a hand for us.
Yeah, well, actually, it's I've got a whole bunch that I'll be putting together for my next podcast on full contact poker. I did an all strategy one. I'm going to do another, but I'll give you guys one specific one that took place this last weekend when I played the 25Ks at the Aria High-Rollers. And obviously when you play in these things, you're playing against all the tough cookies and the top cookies. And, you want me to just go right into the hand?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and as much kind of like backstory, as you're able to give in terms of like your history with the people you're playing against is much appreciated.
Okay, so this is a weird one because something weird happens. It's the big high roller, so we pretty much know everybody at the table. We have a player go broke, right? So it's a situation where there's a dead small blind. The blinds are 500, 1,000, which is the pretty early stages. And so Brian Rast saw the blind out there and thought, so he limped under the gun, like, mistakenly. And it was very obvious that he did not mean to limp, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Clearly he was like, oh, shit, he thought he was big blind. So he limps for 1,000. I'm in the cutoff with 2 queens. So I decided to make it 3,000. And, you could argue that I could make it a little more, considering there's more dead money out there. But I thought I'd just go for 3. Tom Marchese, one of the best poker players in the world, calls on the button. And so both blinds fold. And Rast, since he's already got 1,000 in, he's like, he's pretty stubborn. He's not a guy that likes to, like, fold when he's got money in there. So he calls the extra 2,000.
Do you know the average, like the average stack at that time, as well as the stack sizes of the 2 different players just before we head to the flop?
Yeah, well, in this tournament, you start 500 to 1,000 blinds for the first 3 levels, and you start with 100K in chips. Okay. So everyone's 100 big blinds deep, and that's roughly the case here. And ultimately, I didn't add that because it's kind of irrelevant to the hand and the way that it plays. It doesn't actually mean anything. But so anyway, the flop comes 5 deuce deuce with 2 hearts, which is an excellent flop for a hand like 2 queens. In a 3-way pot, I've got Marchese calling the button. Very unlikely he has a deuce. Now Rast, on the other hand, he had that goofy situation where normally a guy limps under the gun, calls a raise, he doesn't have a deuce, but this is different. So anyway, I decided to bet 5,000. Relatively smallish on the smaller bet. Not small. It's pretty standard, I'd say. And of course, Marchese, and Rast calls from the big blind. So when he calls me here, I put him on a lot of different possibilities. He could have a 5. He could have a gut shot with a hand like ace-4, ace-3. He could potentially have a flush draw. And of course, the deuce is still possible. Him having a pair higher than queens, I know is impossible, right? So really liking the situation.
So you already said he's going to be calling the big blind fairly wide. Do you think he's going to have many offsuit deuces in his range? Ace deuce offsuit, king deuce offsuit, or just probably, some of the better suited deuces?
Well, those 2 specifically, ace deuce, king deuce, I definitely think offsuit would be in his range based on the way the hand played out. But other than that, I don't think queen deuce, jack deuce offsuit are. Every suited deuce, virtually every single suited deuce, I think is in his range.
Right.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
And just to the bet sizing, Daniel. So you bet like 5,000 into an approximately like $10,000 pot, right?
Yep.
So do you feel like you're betting your entire range on this board texture with a sizing like that?
Yes, which is kind of why I did it. If I have ace queen there and I'm betting, I'm usually going to bet about 5. There was 10-5 exactly in the pot. I don't do the 30% post-flop bets like a lot of the younger guys have done, and I think that they will adjust that strategy once they figure out that there's some holes in it long term. So I like to make my bet size a little more substantial so that people don't float quite as cheaply and don't get the turns and rivers without having to pay a little more heat. And it also helps define their hands a little bit more when you make a little bit bigger of a size.
Okay.
So moving to the turn. The turn is literally, not considering his range is probably the worst turn I could see, and it's a 5. So now the board is 5-5 deuce deuce with 2 hearts. He checks, and I'm faced with the dilemma: of whether I should go ahead and bet this to protect against the flush draw. The danger here, there's a lot of danger in that my range is somewhat capped, in that it's very unlikely I have a 5 or a deuce, and he is a really strong, good player that may turn a flush draw or a gut shot into a bluff with a check raise on the turn. So ultimately, against a player like Brian Rast, I decided it was a better play to check back on the turn.
Yeah, and that makes total sense because I think, you're really likely to get raised by any sort of semi-bluffing hand because, I mean, he could easily have all of his deuces at this point in all of his 5s, and it's just a huge part of his range. So, yeah, I think it's a clear check. I agree.
Daniel, do you feel like Brian is maybe going to be like from an exploitative versus game theory perspective standpoint? Do you think he's going to be check raising like exploitably often against you in this spot because he has such a range advantage?
Somewhat, yeah. And so that's why, for me, when I'm considering this bet, if I'm betting here on this turn, I'm betting with the intention of actually having to call the check raise, only because Brian is capable. Against, like, a guy who is, from Middle America, 65 years old, wearing a cowboy hat, praise me here, it's a pretty safe fold. Against Brian Rast, you can't really put yourself in a spot where you're so exploitable, where he can check raise you in this spot and you fold. So that's the reason I think that, like, it just makes a lot more sense to check back the turn. And it also allows me to maybe pick off some bluffs if he had a hand like 4-6 or 3-4 that misses the river. He may now turn that into a bluff, which I can bluff catch with queens, right?
Yeah, I guess the reason that I asked is my first instinct is that a check is best, but if Brian, in this particular scenario, especially maybe because he made the mistake of putting the blind in, if you think he's going to be just check raise bluffing you too much, you could kind of bet small with the intention of just calling it off on the river.
Right. Typically not the type of situation I like to put myself in tournament poker. Spots where I'm going to have to guess for a big significant amount of my chips, and every time I'm wrong, I just screwed myself, and I just have to hope that this is the one. I don't like to put myself in tough spots, and I think checking is just the optimal play there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think betting with the intention of calling is sort of both checking and bet calling seem like somewhat zero EV plays, or slightly plus EV, but not super high EV plays, and bet calling is just a lot more variance, and I think in a tournament doesn't make sense. I also think that this card is so bad for our range. Brian has, I think, actually a lot more 5s and deuces than drawing hands here, or at least a ratio that's unfavorable compared to a lot of situations where there's a lot of semi-bluffs possible and a bad card comes to us on the turn. So yeah, I absolutely think check.
Right. So my intent was to check this turn with all intent to just call it off on the river. He's going to I'm assuming he's going to bet 2/3 of pot when he bets, so I'm planning on paying it off because I've obviously under-repped my hand with the check back on the turn. For the river card, I mean, if I thought the turn was bad for my range, the river's worse. The river's the 4 of hearts, okay?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now he decides to bet 13,000 when that card hits. So I'm going through all the possible hands that I can beat and wondering whether or not he would bet them. Some of those hands I could beat are ace-4, 3-4, 4-6. The question is, does he turn those hands into a bluff? Every other hand, like ace-3, 2 hearts, a 5, or a deuce, I lose to. However, it is Brian Rast, right?
Yeah.
So it's it's just a tough spot to be in. I elected to fold because I just felt like there wasn't enough that I beat, and even though Brian Rast is like a crazy wild kooky player, even like crazy wild players sometimes hit something. So so it was a weird spot. But even though I have queens, which is seems like too good to fold for a lot of people who may not understand the dynamic of the situation as well, it seemed like an easy lay down on the river, actually.
Mm-hmm. I think folding, because this is such a horrible run out for us, I agree. I think folding is correct. I'm trying to think, just as sort of a thought experiment, like, how many better hands do we have? Because, while I think it's okay on, the worst possible runouts, this being one of them, to fold close to, if not our whole range, queens does strike me as potentially one of the best hands you'll have here. I guess you would probably open, ace-5 suited from the cutoff. Do you think you have any other 5s in your range?
Not likely. Although because it was a unique, weird situation where he limped incorrectly, there's the case to be made for raising with hands like 5-6 suited in that spot. But I wouldn't say that. And even if I did have that hand, I'm always going to bet the turn.
Yeah.
Because it looked like it. So why would I have the hand and check back on the turn? So I would say by the river, just no way I have a 5, and I think he knows that.
Yeah, I agree, and I think you might not even bet it on the flop.
Well, I think I would actually against 2 players, one, calling on the button, and one player in the big blind, essentially in the big blind. I think you should bet a 5-6 on a 5-deuce board on that flop to just avoid the myriad of bad cards that come on the turn that just give somebody give the pot for free.
Yeah, multi-way, I can definitely get behind that.
Another part of this thought experiment is, obviously Brian Rast, as you said, Daniel, he'll have 2-4 suited in his range, but he'll also have like pocket 6s, pocket 7s, pocket 8s in his range, right? He's probably not 3-betting those.
Well, I mean, those are all possible, although, again, part of what makes me a skilled player, that's different than online, is gauging the reaction of when he limped.
Mm-hmm.
It clearly being a mistake that he wasn't happy about. Whereas with 6s or 7s, he's fine. He probably would have raised with those hands in the 1 hole anyway. So I didn't think that he had a pair. It was more like, oops, I've got myself in a pickle with a bad hand, but I'm getting priced in, so let's call. So I don't think 6s or 7s, he makes the same kind of physical reaction with those types of hands.
Okay, yeah, that's important. Because, I think if you didn't have that physical read, just because it's one of the best hands you can have, it might be a lot closer to a call because he's probably smart enough to know that, it might be correct to turn those hands into a bluff against you when it's such a good run out for his range versus yours. But if you could take those hands out of his range, even if he does bluff with those kind of few hand combos you identified, he still just has so many value hands here. So I can get behind the fold as well.
It's kind of funny, the worse his range is pre-flop, the better it is now.
Yeah, one of the few boards where that's true.
Yeah. That's a funny hand, and I mean, I think against most players it's a pretty clear fold. You have to be pretty maniacal and optimistic to show up with enough bluffs here, I think.
Yeah, I would think that, I would have called him on this river, obviously with a deuce. Or if I'd made a flush on the river, I think that hand's probably too strong to fold, depending how high it is. Frankly, my hand is essentially pretty close. Since I rule out 6s and 7s, my hand is the same as a 7-high flush.
Yeah.
So unless I had, I guess the right hand to make for it to be different would be with, jack high or better in terms of flushes, but, folding 7, 8, and 9 high flushes because it's essentially the same hand as queens.
Yeah, he's probably going to... You would say he's going to thinly value about a 9 high flush here, right?
I think he's betting 100% of his flushes.
Okay, yeah.
He's betting 100% of his flushes. The question is if you have, if you have an 8 high flush or a 9 high flush, just based on simple math, if he has a flush, he beats you I don't know how 99% of the time or something.
Cool. Well.
That's gross.
Yeah.
Well, I know that was in the early stages. I think probably a lot of our listeners already know how what your results were in the event, but if for the rest, there's no TV coverage or anything of that, right? So you can go ahead and spoil it.
That's just a weekend. They're kind of fun. They're a little turbo-y near the end. Once they start out relatively deep, but once you get past 4 hours, they're kind of crapshooty, all-in turbo style things. But they're fun, and I didn't do any good. I mean, any well. It was a re-entry tournament. I fired a couple bullets at it, but in the end, I didn't cash.
So, when you play these tournaments, what's your main motivation for firing a weekend 25K?
Well, these are the first ones that I played. I played 100K they had there before, and of course, I played the Super High-Roller Bowl, which is going to be a 100,000 buy-in. For me, I haven't played a lot of poker recently, and I wanted to practice a little bit for the Super High-Roller Bowl because these are the types of players I'm going to be facing against. And you're at a distinct disadvantage if you're playing in an event where everyone knows each other's tendencies and you don't have that same knowledge. So I really wanted to get a feel for what people are doing in the court. And also, I did a video blog about the weekend, and also plan to use some of the hands to, talk about it on a future podcast. But mostly it was just to stay sharp and, play against some of the top players.
It's interesting that you have with those small, tough fields, it's interesting to have an opportunity to practice for a larger event. I feel like that's not, to the same degree, something that most poker players who are, playing in certain fields are going to have an opportunity to do. So it's sort of just an interesting situation for me to think about being in. Well, I wanted to ask you, at this point in the game, in your career and at your sophistication as a player, how do you approach, continuing your poker education and learning more about the game?
Well, frankly, it hasn't changed all that much in the 20 years, surprisingly. I didn't go to the school of Fedor Holtz, where I grew up with spreadsheets and breaking down ranges and, cutoffs against 7 players versus 9 players and stuff like that. My study is typically watching tape, kind of like, an NFL coach would watch game film. I like to go over what my opponents are doing. And really the best way for me to learn how to play better or to keep sharp is by teaching. I know that, for example, I did a mixed game. I won a horse tournament on the W Coupe last fall, and me and Jason Somerville, we went over every single hand in a video. And just the process of doing that reinforces a lot of things, opens up my mind to new things. But for me at this stage in my career, it's less about learning to play the game better and more about being more mentally prepared than my opponents.
Mm-hmm. And when you're watching that film or that analogy, I guess it's more literal, but are you mostly watching to understand your opponents better, or to, I don't know if correcting your own mistakes is the right word, but to evaluate your own play?
Well, I mean, obviously I see the hands that I play and I analyze them, but I typically do that right after they're done. This is mostly for me to, sort of, for example, Fedor Holtz is a guy who's obviously done really well the last year and a half. I haven't had a lot of experience with him, playing against him. So I want to see what he's up to next time I'm up against him. Mm-hmm. So I have an understanding of like I know that not knowing who Dan Coleman was when I lost to him heads up in the one drop and not really knowing his tendencies probably cost me that tournament. Because I might have played a little differently knowing that he's not the crazy young, wild, three-betting, goofy kid. He's pretty solid and just has it. So I do that. I look to see kind of what type of situations these guys look to capitalize on, what types of situations they're folding on that I think might be leaks. And on top of that, I'm looking really for physical tells I can rely on that reinforce things that I may have already thought, and I keep notes on that. Like I have a notepad in my phone that has a wide variety of players with specific physical tells that I find on them. And, whenever I play against them, I look it up to remind myself. That's
really cool because, I guess in your situation, you're just getting a lot more bang for your buck, for your time spent actually studying the opponents you're going to have to encounter, both in these high buy-in events and likely at some final tables here and there. But I'm curious, your skill in the main event is highly prodigious, and the game has evolved a lot. So in my mind, the sort of upper echelon of strategy, maybe you disagree with this, but in my mind it has, increased over the years as people have put more thought into the game. And so there's, I guess, maybe a wider chasm of skill level and people who fall into various slots along that. And you seem to be just really gifted at putting people on the right level. And I'm wondering if that's become more difficult over the years, or if it's just gone at a pace where you've sort of managed it as it's happened.
So for wrenches, the game has changed, and it will always change in terms of bet size and pre-flop. We're seeing trends back to the way things were, even 15, 20 years ago, people upping them. I would say that it hasn't changed nearly as much as it has changed. It really hasn't changed that much. Poker's still poker. I would say that intellectually, the best players in terms of the way they approach the game has changed dramatically. So now, typically, guys like Isaac Haxton, for example, he's looking to play GTO, game theory optimal. He's looking to be balanced in all situations. He's factoring in blockers, like that's probably like the buzzword in the last 2 years has been blockers. Like, well, called because like I had the 4 of hearts blocker. I'm like, okay, whatever you say, buddy. Like, but that's probably the one thing that people are using in order to kind of make decisions. So, for example, they're like up against the guy where they think he either has the flush or he doesn't. And if he doesn't, you win. If he does, they lose. So they'll look in their hand and see if they have one of the flush cards. And if they do, they call. If they don't, they fold. So they're not basing it on a read of the player. They're not basing it on the situation. They're not basing it on history. They're basing it simply on, the range they put them on, and then whatever sort of clues that they may have in their hand in terms of a blocker that could sway them that way. And it's a different way to think about the game. Certainly, for online poker, you don't have physical tells, so it's a lot more viable there. I still think the physical tells supersede that in terms of a way of approaching the game.
Do you feel like there's some players you play against that do such a good job of concealing physical tells that, like, your large edge that you have against most of your opponents doesn't really work against those kind of more elite players?
No, for sure. I mean, there's plenty of guys that I play with all the time, and I've got no notes on them whatsoever. Yeah. I have no notes specifically on like physical tells, but you still are going to find, okay, I know this one guy when he's blitzed and he's really high and he smoked a lot of pot, he's more likely to make overbet bluffs. When he's so, he's more likely to play a little snug in the early positions. Okay, I'm not talking about Bryn Kenny. Don't worry. Well, yeah, but but yeah. So outside of physical tells, you just get sense of what people like to do. Because when you think about tournament poker specifically, ABC poker isn't the way in which the very best players succeed. They always have something specific they do differently than everyone else that makes them special. And it's important for me to know what types of tricks that these guys like to depend on, whatever they may be.
So do you think that sort of individuality of strategy is more of a hindrance or an advantage? I mean, obviously it could be both to varying degrees, but since that's what you're looking for, it sounds like a player who maybe doesn't depend on any tricks per se is going to be someone who's going to be a lot harder for you to crack.
Well, maybe. I don't know. Like I said, obviously there's a new trend in terms of a lot of people focusing really, really hard on playing a GTO style, playing game theory optimal. And I actually think it's misguided. I really do, because tournament poker, when you're playing live especially, you'll never hit the long run where it's relevant enough to be totally balanced in every situation. What's much more of an effective strategy is being exploitative and looking for holes or looking for trends in opponents or taking advantage of how people perceive your game. And that's probably the most valuable tool a skilled player can have is the self-awareness of understanding, okay, this guy in this spot knows I never bluff. So what can I do here to steal this pot?
Sounds like you should bluff.
Yeah. Daniel, is there any, have you ever done any type of personal study in regards to game theory that you feel like has helped you become a more exploitative player? Better exploit people in game?
I would say definitely not. Most definitely not, no. If I was 22 or 23 and I was just starting out in the game, I would highly recommend having a deep understanding of game theory optimal play, and because it is prevalent now with a lot of younger players. But I'm not in that place anymore. I have a good life, and I don't necessarily spend my free time doing the work on that stuff. And frankly, if I felt it was necessary in order to be successful, or I felt like it could really help my game in a big way, I still would, but I really don't, because tournaments are unique in that I just don't think I think if you were going to be a professional cash game player, then you definitely want to focus on being balanced in spots, especially if you're playing against the same people. If you're playing in tournaments, I don't care if everyone else at the table knows that against this guy, if I'm betting 80% of pot, I have it, and when I bet 55% of pot, I'm bluffing. I don't care if everyone else at the table knows that, as long as the guy I'm up against doesn't.
Right. So you mentioned, some advice you have for up-and-coming, maybe lower stakes players today. Is there anything else you'd recommend to today's, fresh crop of poker players?
Well, I would say that, one of the best ways to learn in terms of the way that I did is to talk through hands. So after sessions, whether you're playing online and you want to, have the hand histories or jot them down, and actually discuss them with a peer group of people that can actually maybe open up your eyes to different ways to play it. I'd also say the biggest mistake most young players make, almost all of them, and I made the same one too, is to underestimate players that came before you that, you think, well, they don't know what they're doing because they don't play GTO or they don't know this or that or this. They'll surprise you. A guy like Dole Brunson who's 84 and, people might mock the way that he plays because that's definitely not, plus EV. Underestimating people like that is a huge mistake because a guy like him who's been around a long time has other skills and traits. So I think be open-minded to different types of playing styles and don't just shut them down because you think you've done the computation to prove that this guy's a bad player because he did X, Y, or Z.
Yeah, I think that's sound advice, and I think maybe we're being subtly contrarian, but you're definitely speaking our language. We try and be very exploitative on this podcast, which tends to be pretty easy since we mostly talk about low-stakes cash games, which are sort of a hotbed for exploitative opportunities.
Yeah, I think kind of what all three of us agree that like the vast majority of the time, almost all the time, when playing like low stakes or when playing tournaments of, I guess what you're saying, any level, you should really be exploitative close to 100% of the time. But I think from Jack and I's experience, we've gotten a lot of value from studying game theory because it's helped us become more exploitative, like understanding better how an opponent is truly like really capped here allows us to, increase our bluffing frequency way more than we kind of feel like is necessarily correct in the moment after we run like, oh, wow, if they're going to fold this much, or that means we can bluff all the time or, situations like that.
Yeah, no, there's definitely value in doing that sort of thing. And I think that one of the things I guess I have a nostalgia and appreciation for is old school players who kind of did this instinctively. Yeah. And they did this instinctively to just know, like, well, this guy never has this or that. Well, he can't call me here if I shove. It wasn't like down the range. It was simply like, he ain't going to call me now because he can't have this or that. So I have like, and I do believe that like ultimately the best players who reach the highest levels, they have an RNG that's naturally built into their brain. They also just kind of get there anyway without actually, obviously maybe they could fine tune it by doing the work and studying game theory. But I think like the naturals, the real just poker players who just figure it out, they get there anyway despite not really knowing that they got there. So a lot of terms that you guys coined today that are used are plays that have been made for 20 years. They just didn't have a name, like floating. There was no such, we didn't know it. There wasn't a term. We just called it, I wrote a column, I think years ago called Call with Nothing to Bluff Later.
Yeah.
Like
well,
inventing the wheel. It's simply, getting, it's scientifically breaking down the things that have been going on for the last, 20 years or so.
I'm positive you're right. It's interesting bringing up specifically floating because we did an event with Greg Raymer where he made a statement along the lines of like floating wasn't a thing in 2005.
Yeah.
And then like this one specific opponent of his sort of invented it. And
okay, well, I can tell you this. I've been doing it since, I don't know, let's say 1999. So maybe I invented it.
Yeah. I'll let him know.
Yeah.
Unless you listen to this, Greg, shout out.
So Daniel, Jack asked, what is some advice you have for the young up and coming pros, in terms of, and you kind of talked about improving their game, but in a more kind of just like thinking about life in general advice, would you recommend people generally speaking to get into poker now? Is now, a good time for, young, hardworking people to make a living playing poker? Is it going to make them fulfill? Is it going to, bring them happiness, not just cash?
Absolutely. So, it's an interesting question. It's loaded. And I have to say that it would depend on what they're looking to do. And the first thing I would say to any young player who's thinking about using poker as a way to make a living and live a balanced life is, what is your vision? Okay. And when I say that, what I mean is, what exactly do you want to create? Okay. So the guy says, maybe I want to make a lot of money. For what? To accomplish what? so that I can live a life of abundance and freedom. Okay, so what does that look like for you? How much money do you need to make? And really come out with a solid 5 to 10 year plan of what you want it to look like. And then realize that this isn't all glitz and glamour, that you're going to have to make a lot of sacrifices if you want to do this well. When I was that age, I sacrificed partying, going out, meeting girls, the whole deal. And I was sitting at a poker table 8 to 10 hours a day. And then when I was done, I was going over the hands in my head for 2-3 hours, wake up, do the same thing the next day. So I would say just really have a clear plan, and you want to find some balance in your life too. If you don't have a vision for why you want to do this and you're just making money for the sake of making money, you're doomed. I promise you. You are doomed to find that like there's no meaning in life, if you will. It's really important to say, okay, I'm doing this because of this. I want this in my life. I want to meet a woman and have kids, and I want to support them through poker. Whatever it is for you specifically, get clear on it before you jump down this journey. Because what you find is, and I see this with a lot of people today, they're just going through the motions. They've been doing it 5-6 years. They don't really know where they're at. They don't know where they're going because they haven't really sat down and thought about a clear vision for their life.
Well, it seems like you've found a lot of meaning in your own life outside of poker, but I'm curious. I was reading through your 2017 goals, and you seem to have some long-term goals to be atop certain poker leaderboards, and I'm just wondering how you're finding balancing those ambitions with, other passions you found in your life.
It's actually gotten easier and easier with age, because when I write that goals blog every January, I think about the year ahead and what I'd like to accomplish and whatever my vision is in my poker career, and I write them out. Once I've done that, I don't really look back at it until the end of the year. I'm not attached to the result. I'm just clear on what the journey is that I'd like to embark on. I do so, and at the end of the year, if I hit 0 of the goals, obviously, I'd rather hit some, and it's an accomplishment, but I don't get down on it. I just go, okay, let's readjust and look at some other things. But I'm very careful about the goals that I do set now that are within a framework that allow me to have the balance that I want, allow me to do the things that I want. Outside of the World Series of Poker, you don't see a chunk of play in terms of what I've got scheduled. Just the World Series of Poker is special to me, and it's a lot of fun to grind hard that month or so. But outside of that, I have plenty of time to get to the gym, to work out, to create content now for the poker community, to make a difference for people that I coach and things like that.
I'm sure you've talked about this, at length, but I'm curious, and I'm sure our listeners are curious, why you're so keen to give back to the poker community in terms of the content you're creating. I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Well, partly, I don't necessarily need money anymore. I've kind of, gotten to a place in my life where I'll be safe the rest of my life. And I've always enjoyed creating content. I've been doing YouTube videos for, 7-8 years. I took a long hiatus from it, and just realizing that there's a thirst in the community for poker content and poker hand breakdowns, and obviously other people are doing that, and it's been very popular. So I thought, well, why not throw my hat in the ring in there? And it's also an opportunity. My long-term vision and plan with it is to make the channel into more than just a poker channel. Right now, I'm doing the Monday and Thursday videos. I'm going to do a video blog every few weeks or so, and then the podcast. But I'd like to expand past that and do some much more inspirational type content that's more mainstream and can maybe make a difference for a lot of people who are struggling with whatever it is they're struggling with.
Are there any books, kind of just broadly speaking, that you would recommend for people to read? Because it just based on the way you're kind of talking about your vision and goals, it sounds like this is coming from something that you've learned over your years, and I'm guessing that there's some literature that people would find helpful, to achieve their own goals.
Yeah, no, I've certainly read a lot of books, and a lot of books that reinforce what I did a course about 4 years ago called Choice Center in Las Vegas, which is about emotional intelligence and really touches on all these specific things in terms of goal setting and a lot of that stuff. And I found it was very, very effective. On top of that, I've read a lot of books. One of them, which I think is a really easy read for your listeners, it's 140 pages. You can get through it in one sitting. It's called The 4 Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. And it's essentially 4 basic principles for living an abundant life. And I can just give you the 4 because it's very simple. Number 1 is be impeccable with your word to yourself and to others. So if you say you're going to do something, do it. 2 Don't take anything personal. Someone says you're ugly, say thank you. Just it's neutral. If they say you're pretty, it's neutral. It's not personal. Third, don't make assumptions. Often we make assumptions about what someone thinks or that, or this is going to be this is going to be that, without actually going to the source. And number 4 is the most important one that ties in the other 3. You're going to break your word. You're going to take things personal, and you're going to make assumptions. You're human. Do your best. That's number 4. Do your best to, focus on, those 4 principles, and you just notice that it's so much more attainable to have the dream life and live in a. Imagine this. Imagine like everything that you said you were ever going to do in your life, you actually did it, right? The chances of you actually living your dream life, so much more likely. But when you say things like, oh, I'm going to start eating better and I'm going to start working out, and then you don't do it, well, guess what? Yeah, the dream life that you're dreaming of is not going to happen until you start being impeccable with your word, not just to others, but to yourself. So 4 agreements would be top of my list.
Daniel, we don't want to take too much more of your time, but we'd love to give you an opportunity. I know we've talked about the website, the podcast. Is there anything else that you're working on, you're passionate about, you just want to tell a chunk of people about right now before we let you go?
Well, right now, like sort of my passion project is, with a YouTube channel that is going to be, you can get through Full Contact Poker, and that's where the podcast is. So working on content, it was one of my goals this year was to create a lot more content. Cutting some video blogs has been fun, giving people an insight into sort of my life. So Mondays, I'm doing like a poker tip that's geared towards maybe the amateur, beginning player, mediocre player. And then Thursdays, we're going to get into some hand breakdowns that are a little more intense. And that's going to be the rolled out schedule for at least, the rest of the year. So that's basically it. You can find, subscribe to the YouTube channel and you won't miss any of them.
Awesome. Well, Daniel, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Hope you have a great rest of your night. And yeah, thank you for everything, not just this. I mean, speaking for both Jack and I, it's not the first time we're hearing your voice, and you've been instrumental in, both of ours and many people's development in poker, whether as a profession or just love for the game. So truly, thank you.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate it. And good luck to you guys. I hope you crush it.
Hey, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to us on iTunes and check out some of our other 62 episodes. Also, head over to justhandspoker.com and check out our blog and other great strategy resources.